They were called the Forgotten Front, a land far from Europe's blood-soaked battlefields, yet no less dangerous. While the world's eyes were fixed on Normandy, Stalingrad, and Pearl Harbor, something far more secret was unfolding across the jungles, cities, and coastlines of Latin America. A war fought not with tanks and bombers, but with whispers, lies, and invisible hands. Radio transmitters buried beneath banana plantations, German spies hiding in Rio de Janeiro's high society, American agents disguised as diplomats, orchestrating coups from smoky hotel rooms in Buenos Aires. And deep within Brazil's mountains, a group of scientists caught between two powers, the Nazis and the Americans, both desperate for their loyalty. This was the war behind the war, where friendship was a weapon, neutrality was an illusion, and every message on the airwaves could decide the fate of a continent. This is the story the world never truly saw, the Hidden Front, Latin America's secret war in World War II. As Europe exploded into chaos in September 1939, Latin America watched with uneasy calm. Brazil's beaches were peaceful, Argentina's tango halls were full, and coffee ships sailed freely across the Atlantic. But beneath the calm, nations were dividing, silently choosing sides. Most Latin American countries declared neutrality, but neutrality itself became a weapon. Germany had deep roots in the region. Tens of thousands of German immigrants lived in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. They built schools, newspapers, and businesses that, on the surface, looked ordinary. But many of these communities became fertile ground for Nazi propaganda. Berlin's Ministry of Propaganda sent agents disguised as cultural attachés. They spread films, pamphlets, and German-language radio broadcasts glorifying Hitler's new order. In Sao Paulo, one radio station secretly switched from Sam Atrocities, Ba music to Nazi speeches during the night shift. Listeners thought it was just a glitch. It wasn't. Meanwhile, the United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, realized something terrifying. If the Nazis gained influence in Latin America, they could control the Atlantic routes and threaten the Panama Canal, the lifeline of the Western Hemisphere. So Washington formed a secret network, the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, CIAA, led by Nelson Rockefeller. Its mission? Win the hearts and minds of Latin Americans through music, film, and diplomacy, and crush the Nazi message before it spread too far. The battle for Latin America had begun, not with bullets, but with words. By 1940, radios became the most powerful weapons in the hemisphere. Every night, people tuned in to shortwave frequencies from Europe, hearing German broadcasts praising Hitler's victories. In Buenos Aires, Radio Zissen transmitted German news twisted with anti-American propaganda. The announcers spoke perfect Spanish and Portuguese, convincing, confident, and eerily persuasive. They called the Allies imperialists and painted Germany as the true friend of Latin America. But the Americans countered fast. Hollywood stars like Walt Disney and Orson Welles were sent south under cultural missions. Disney's Saludos Amigos was not just a cartoon, it was a weapon of friendship, designed to portray the U.S. as a benevolent neighbor. At the same time, the CIAA funded Latin American radio stations, promoting democratic values, playing jazz, and broadcasting anti-Nazi content disguised as entertainment. In cities like Lima and Rio, the streets buzzed with rumors. Who was working for Germany? Who was taking money from the Americans? Propaganda had turned into espionage. Neighbors stopped trusting each other, and governments began to crack. Brazil was the key. The largest nation in Latin America, rich in natural resources and strategically located near the Atlantic shipping routes. President Getulio Vargas, known as the Father of the Poor, ruled Brazil with an iron hand. He admired some aspects of fascism, its order, its nationalism, its discipline. But he also knew Brazil's future depended on trade with the United States. By 1941, both sides were courting him. Berlin offered technology and prestige. Washington offered cash, oil, and military equipment. As U-boats prowled the South Atlantic, German submarines began sinking Brazilian merchant ships. coffins returned home wrapped in flags, and public anger boiled over. On the streets of Rio, thousands demanded revenge. Vargas could no longer remain neutral. In 1942, Brazil declared war on the Axis powers, the only South American nation to send troops to Europe. But the decision came with a price. Dozens of suspected Nazi sympathizers were rounded up, German-language schools were shut down, and secret police filled their prisons with potential enemies of the state. The propaganda war had turned into real war. What most people didn't know was how deeply the Nazi intelligence networks had already infiltrated Latin America. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, had established safe houses across the continent. In Mexico City, a network called Operation Bolívar sent coded messages to Berlin via neutral Spain. In Argentina, a German businessman named Ludwig Freude acted as the liaison between Nazi agents and local politicians. Freude's mansion in Buenos Aires became a hub for secret meetings. The Nazis planned sabotage, gathered naval intelligence, and tracked Allied shipping routes. They even had a plan to use remote airfields in Chile for refueling U-boats. Meanwhile, the Americans responded with Operation Bolívar's Mirror, counterintelligence. FBI agents arrived disguised as journalists, engineers, even missionaries. They collaborated with local police, sometimes bribing, sometimes blackmailing, all to hunt Nazi agents. Arrests were made quietly. Disappeared men were never mentioned again. And across Latin America, a shadow war raged, invisible to the world. Among the most valuable targets in this hidden war were not soldiers, but scientists. Germany's technological power was legendary. Rocket engineers, chemical experts, and metallurgists who could change the future of warfare. Some of them fled Europe, settling in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, claiming to be refugees. But others were sent by the Nazi regime itself to continue research far from Allied eyes. In the mountains of southern Brazil, one laboratory was rumored to be experimenting with radio technology capable of tracking Allied ships. The U.S. intelligence took notice. In 1943, a joint American-Brazilian mission raided the facility. Officially, it was a weather station. Unofficially, they found crates of German equipment and coded blueprints marked with the Eagle insignia. The scientists were quietly taken to the United States, some under the same secret program that would later become Operation Paperclip. And once again, Latin America had become the world's chessboard. As the war raged in Europe, a quieter battle was being fought across the Andes. Chile and Argentina, nations of stunning beauty and strong German heritage, became fertile ground for ideological infiltration. In Santiago, Chile, the German club served more than schnitzel and beer. Behind closed doors, men in crisp suits discussed politics, coded shipments, and banking channels that quietly funneled money to the Reich. Meanwhile, German ships arrived in Valparaiso carrying agricultural machinery that often turned out to be military components. But the United States was watching. A special intelligence branch, known as the Special Intelligence Service, SIS, operated from inside the American embassy. Their job: expose every Nazi connection hiding beneath Chile's polite society. Reports flooded in. Lists of suspected businessmen, professors, and radio technicians. One American agent described it best. "It's not the guns we fear in Chile, it's the microphones." Dozens of shortwave transmitters were discovered in homes and offices, used to send coded weather reports to German submarines. Every frequency, every signal mattered. For each message intercepted, Allied convoys changed course, and lives were saved. But for every transmitter they shut down, another appeared elsewhere. It was a war of ghosts, fought in silence and heard only by static. By 1943, Washington's patience had ended. President Roosevelt believed Latin America must be secured, fully and permanently, before the Nazis could regroup. Under the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the U.S. began a campaign of total infiltration. Agents spread through Mexico, Colombia, and Peru, building local networks, bribing officials, and planting loyal informants. Cultural propaganda followed: jazz concerts, Hollywood films, and newsreels showing American heroism. The U.S. wasn't just fighting Germany anymore. It was fighting for Latin America's soul. Meanwhile, Rockefeller's CIA poured millions into educational programs. In reality, many were fronts for psychological warfare. They controlled the press, published anti-fascist novels, and ensured that every Latin American newspaper echoed Washington's tone. And behind the diplomacy, there was fear. Fear that if Latin America didn't align with the U.S. post-war Germany, or even the Soviet Union, might find a new home there. For the Americans, control wasn't just about ideology. It was about geography and survival. Mexico stood at a crossroads. It had a complex relationship with both the U.S. and Germany. Many of its elites admired Germany's discipline. Others hated fascism with a passion. When the U.S. entered the war, Mexico followed, but cautiously. German submarines had sunk 2 Mexican tankers in the Gulf of Mexico, killing dozens. That was the breaking point. Mexico declared war on the Axis in 1942. But, even then, secret German networks persisted in the northern deserts. U.S. intelligence uncovered evidence of Nazi sympathizers sending coded radio transmissions from rural areas using portable transmitters hidden in abandoned haciendas. Meanwhile, Mexico's universities became hotbeds of debate. Students split between Marxists, nationalists, and fascist sympathizers, each believing their ideology would shape the nation's destiny. In one of the most bizarre episodes, a Mexican radio host began reading coded poems on air. Each poem contained coordinates for German submarines operating off the coast. By the time the OSS cracked the code, dozens of Allied ships had already been attacked. Mexico's entry into the war ended those networks, but scars remained. For the first time, Latin America realized how deep the invisible war had gone. Argentina, proud, independent, and stubbornly neutral, became a magnet for both sides. President Ramon Castillo refused to take orders from Washington, arguing that neutrality was Argentina's sovereign right. But neutrality quickly turned into suspicion. German influence ran deep in Buenos Aires. Wealthy industrialists and former diplomats openly sympathized with the Reich. Secret meetings were held at the Jockey Club, and German U-boats were seen refueling off Argentina's coast. When the Allies demanded that Argentina cut ties with the Axis, the government resisted. The U.S. retaliated with economic pressure, cutting off exports and isolating Argentina diplomatically. By 1943, the tension was unbearable. A coup erupted in Buenos Aires, overthrowing Castillo's government. Among the young officers who supported the coup was Juan Domingo Perón, a man who would later dominate Argentine politics for decades. Perón admired Mussolini's corporatism and Germany's efficiency, but he was also pragmatic. He knew that aligning with the Allies was inevitable. In 1945, Argentina finally declared war on the Axis, one of the last nations to do so. But for many, it was too late. By then, the war was nearly over, and a new chapter was beginning: the escape of the Nazis themselves. As Berlin burned and Hitler's Reich collapsed, ships quietly departed from European ports bound for South America. They carried men who called themselves engineers, technicians, or businessmen. But they were far more than that. They were fugitives, SS officers, scientists, and war criminals seeking new lives, and Latin America welcomed them for a price. Argentina became their sanctuary. Under Perón's secret policy, hundreds of Nazis were given false passports and safe passage. They entered through Spain or Italy, disguised as Red Cross refugees. Among them were infamous figures: Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, Klaus Barbie, men responsible for unspeakable crimes. They melted into Argentine society, took new names, and lived quietly for years. Meanwhile, Brazil and Chile also harbored smaller Nazi colonies, often protected by powerful local families. German schools, Lutheran churches, and cultural associations provided cover. What began as a war of propaganda had turned into a war of memory, a war to erase the past. The Americans knew it. But as the Cold War dawned, Washington's priorities shifted. Communism was now the enemy, not the ghosts of the Reich. And many of these ex-Nazis found new employers, the CIA itself. By 1945, the U.S. Treasury Department began an operation codenamed Safe Haven. Its mission: trace and freeze Nazi assets hidden abroad, especially in Latin American banks. Billions in looted gold, stolen art, and laundered funds had been smuggled through secret accounts in Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Santiago. American agents arrived under diplomatic cover, working with Swiss investigators to follow the money trail. But they soon discovered a wall of silence. Banks refused cooperation, citing client confidentiality. Argentine officials stalled, and evidence mysteriously disappeared. Meanwhile, Nazi sympathizers used the chaos to rebuild their fortunes. Factories, farms, and shipping companies suddenly appeared with suspicious funding. To the untrained eye, they were just post-war businesses. But to those who knew, they were the financial skeleton of a new shadow network, the Fourth Reich dream. For the U.S. safe haven was a failure. The truth was too vast, too buried, and too politically dangerous to expose. Latin America had become both a refuge and a riddle, the war's unburied secret. While Argentina dealt with fugitives, Brazil focused on science. The U.S. realized that Brazil's industrial potential could be decisive in the post-war order. So American engineers and advisors poured in, building air bases, refineries, and research institutes. Among the scientists they brought were Germans, rehabilitated experts captured in Europe. Many had dark pasts, but Washington needed their skills more than their confessions. In the city of São José dos Campos, Brazil began building a new aeronautical center, a place that would later evolve into Embraer, one of the largest aircraft companies in the world. But few knew its foundations were laid by men who once worked for the Reich. To Brazil's leaders, this was progress. To the victims of war, it was betrayal. But in the new global chessboard, morality often came second to power. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but across Latin America, a new kind of war was already beginning. This time, the enemies weren't wearing swastikas. They were wearing suits. The Cold War turned Latin America into a new battleground, a place where ideology, secrecy, and loyalty were constantly tested. Washington's old obsession with Nazi influence was replaced by a deeper paranoia, the spread of communism. But the irony was cruel. Many of the same intelligence networks once built to fight fascism were now being used to crush socialism. In Brazil, military officers who had once helped the Allies now trained under American doctrine, counterinsurgency, anti-communist warfare, psychological operations. In Argentina and Chile, ex-German scientists worked alongside American advisors, developing technologies that would later be used in domestic repression. The propaganda machine shifted, but its method remained the same: control the narrative, control the people. Posters that once warned of Nazi infiltration now screamed, "Beware of Reds." Radio dramas, films, and newspapers carried subtle messages that freedom meant obedience and dissent meant betrayal. The war for hearts and minds had never truly ended. It had simply changed uniforms. By the 1950s, the truth about Latin America's wartime secrets was being erased. Files vanished from embassies, intelligence reports were sealed, and witnesses who knew too much began to disappear. In Argentina, journalists investigating Nazi immigration were mysteriously killed in accidents. In Brazil, university professors who had worked on wartime propaganda were silenced by sudden heart attacks. It wasn't coincidence. It was cleanup. Governments across the continent realized that admitting how deeply the Axis had influenced them and how willingly they had cooperated would destroy their credibility. So, history was rewritten. School books spoke only of Latin solidarity and defense of democracy. The secret war faded into rumor until it became nothing more than a footnote, buried under layers of patriotic revision. But in the small towns of southern Brazil, where old German churches still flew foreign flags on hidden holidays, and in the isolated valleys of Chile where strangers spoke fluent German decades after the war, the truth whispered on. Few today know that during WWII, there existed a massive German spy network spanning all of Latin America. It was called Operation Bolivar, and it was one of Nazi Germany's most ambitious intelligence programs outside Europe. Directed by the WWII, the German military intelligence agency, Operation Bolivar sent hundreds of agents disguised as journalists, merchants, and technicians into Latin America. They used neutral countries like Argentina, Chile, and Mexico as bases to spy on Allied shipping and military movements. Their reports were smuggled through diplomatic pouches, encrypted radio messages, and coded letters hidden inside trade documents. In Brazil alone, dozens of agents were discovered sending secret weather reports to U-boats, but the genius of Operation Bolivar was not its reach. It was its invisibility. The agents blended perfectly into society. They attended church, joined business chambers, and donated to charities. They were neighbors, invisible soldiers of a global empire that believed it could stretch across oceans. When Allied intelligence finally cracked the network, it was 1944. But by then, the damage was done. Dozens of Allied ships had been lost, and the seeds of Nazi ideology had already taken root deep in Latin America's soil. Operation Bolivar had failed militarily, but its shadow would live for decades. In the aftermath of WWII, science became the new battlefield. The race to control knowledge, not land, determined the future of power. Latin America became a magnet for displaced scientists from both sides. German experts arrived under false names, working on aviation, rocketry, and medicine. At the same time, American and British advisors offered funding and protection in exchange for loyalty. Brazil's new National Institute of Technology hosted dozens of anonymous European engineers. In Argentina, Juan Perón famously launched the Pulque project, an attempt to build Latin America's first jet fighter, led by ex-Luftwaffe engineers. To the public, it was progress. To those who knew, it was the continuation of the Third Reich's technological dream. But the scientists brought more than knowledge. They brought ideology. Many were quietly sympathetic to fascism, teaching their new students not just how to build planes, but how to obey authority without question. By the 1960s, those same students would become military officers, and they would bring with them a chilling efficiency when the dictatorships began. The Amazon became a lifeline. With Asia's rubber supply cut off by Japan, the Allies turned to Brazil's vast rainforests. Tens of thousands of rubber soldiers, poor workers from the Northeast, were sent deep into the jungle to harvest latex for the war effort. The conditions were brutal, many never returned, but deeper in the forest, whispers spread of German agents sabotaging the supply lines. Boats sank without cause, bridges collapsed mysteriously. Were these the acts of nature or of sabotage? Reports from the American Office of Strategic Services suggested that Axis operatives were hiding along the Amazon River, posing as traders or missionaries. Even the jungle wasn't neutral anymore. When Europe began to burn, its scientists fled, some to the United States, others to the shadows. But a few went further south, disappearing into the anonymity of Latin America. Among them were men whose minds could change the fate of nations, physicists, chemists, and engineers who once worked for the Reich. They claimed to seek refuge, but were they refugees or infiltrators? Brazil welcomed many under the guise of progress, but U.S. intelligence grew alarmed. Reports suggested that certain German engineers were establishing laboratories near the Amazon, experimenting with chemicals that could serve both agriculture and warfare. It wasn't just a rumor. When Allied agents raided a facility outside Belém, they found crates marked with both chemical formulas and German military codes. A scientific frontier had turned into a silent front line. While Brazil chose the Allies, Argentina walked a darker path. President Ramon Castillo maintained neutrality, but his government was riddled with German sympathizers. Buenos Aires became a playground for spies. Every cafe, every hotel, every embassy whispered secrets. Nazi gold funded businesses. German operatives posed as journalists. The Allies called it the Berlin of the South. From here, coded messages reached Chile, Uruguay, and even Mexico, coordinating Axis propaganda across the continent. The FBI and British MI6 set up a joint station in Rio to monitor Argentina's broadcasts. But every message they intercepted revealed only part of the web. The rest remained hidden, somewhere between Rio and Berlin. Decades after Hitler's death, his methods returned in a new form. In the 1970s, a network of South American dictatorships, led by Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, launched Operation Condor. It was an intelligence alliance designed to hunt, torture, and eliminate political opponents. And many of its tactics came straight from the Reich's playbook. Former Nazi officers living in exile became advisors to secret police units. Gestapo interrogation manuals were translated into Spanish and Portuguese. Camps were built in remote jungles, modeled after concentration camp designs. The circle had closed. The men who had once fled justice in Europe were now teaching a new generation how to control through fear. And once again, the United States looked away, because these dictators, brutal as they were anti-communist allies. The ghosts of WWII had returned, not as soldiers, but as teachers of terror. By the 1980s, human rights activists began unearthing the truth. Declassified CIA documents revealed a disturbing continuity between wartime propaganda and Cold War control. Files showed that American intelligence had knowingly employed dozens of ex-Nazis in Latin America, that they had participated in information control programs, and that many wartime propaganda experts had gone on to advise dictatorships on censorship and psychological warfare. The old propaganda war had evolved into a machine of silence. The same radio networks that once broadcast anti-Nazi messages were now used to mask. As the Cold War ended, the archives finally began to open. In Germany, Argentina, and Brazil, dusty rooms full of forgotten files revealed decades of hidden collaboration. In Rio de Janeiro, historians discovered German embassy ledgers showing payments to local newspapers during WWII. In Buenos Aires, shipping manifests revealed that Nazi gold had been smuggled into South America through humanitarian missions. And in the mountains of Chile, archaeologists found the ruins of Colonia Dignidad, a German colony that had served as both a Nazi refuge and a torture center during the dictatorship. Piece by piece, the puzzle emerged. Latin America had not been a bystander. It had been a battlefield, invisible but real. The revelations shocked a new generation, forcing nations to confront what their parents had buried. For many, it wasn't just history. It was family. Grandfathers who once wore SS medals, politicians whose fortunes were built on Nazi gold, scientists whose inventions came from the ashes of war. The hidden front had finally been exposed. Today, the war is long over, but its echoes still linger, in politics, in industry, in culture. Latin America's relationship with power was forever shaped by that invisible war. The alliances formed in secrecy became the foundation of modern diplomacy. The propaganda models created during WWII evolved into modern media strategies. And the idea that truth can be manufactured, that perception is stronger than reality, still defines global politics. In Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, young historians continue to uncover evidence that entire regions were built upon wartime deception. Museums now display the documents once hidden in embassy vaults, and descendants of both victims and collaborators are finally speaking out. The legacy of the hidden front isn't just about spies or gold or power. It's about the cost of silence. How lies, once told to protect nations, can haunt them for generations. As the camera pans over the jungles, cities, and coastlines of Latin America, when the guns fell silent in 1945, Latin America entered a new war, One fought not with tanks or bullets, but with secrets and silence. Brazil's cities, once echoing with wartime slogans, now buzzed with whispers of betrayal. Who had been loyal to the Allies, and who had played both sides. In Rio, politicians who had quietly traded favors with German businesses suddenly reinvented themselves as patriots. In Buenos Aires, Nazi agents shredded documents, vanished into the crowd, or escaped on mysterious ships bound for the southern ports of Argentina and Chile. The rat lines, they were called, escape routes for war criminals, organized under the very noses of governments claiming neutrality. But beneath this chaos, another layer of conflict was emerging. American intelligence agencies, now newly formed as the OSS and later the CIA, wanted control over every file, every secret, every person who might be of use. Scientists who once worked on German projects were quietly recruited by U.S. officials. And suddenly, the same men who had built weapons for Hitler were designing aircraft and missiles under new flags. The line between justice and opportunity blurred. And in Latin America, that line was never clear to begin with. Brazil had emerged from the war as an unexpected power, a nation that had fought on the winning side but was haunted by divided loyalties. President Getúlio Vargas, who once admired authoritarian rule, was now being reshaped by democratic pressure from the Allies. But he was not ready to give up control so easily. He understood something most leaders didn't. That power in Latin America was not about armies or flags, but about influence. And influence came from the shadows. While Americs, an ambassador spoke of unity and peace, their agents were quietly planting networks of propaganda stations, cultural institutes, and friendship councils. They brought films, radios, books, and money, all designed to shape how people thought, to make sure communism would never take root in the hemisphere. Meanwhile, in the backrooms of Sao Paulo and Havana, old German businessmen regrouped under new company names. They funded local newspapers, supported political campaigns, and helped spread rumors that the Americans were the new occupiers. The war had ended, but the battle for Latin America's soul was just beginning. By 1947, strange disappearances began to occur across Latin America. A journalist in Mexico City investigating Nazi bank accounts vanished after leaving a cafe. A Brazilian historian who uncovered secret trade routes between Rio and Berlin was found dead under mysterious circumstances, officially suicide. And in Buenos Aires, a priest rumored to have sheltered German officers was found floating in the river. None of these cases were connected, officially. But in secret archives years later, investigators found coded messages between U.S. intelligence and local police agencies. They weren't protecting democracy, they were protecting secrets. Propaganda, once a weapon against the Axis, was now being used to erase history itself. Files were rewritten, newspapers were bought, radio broadcasts suddenly shifted tone. The world was entering a new kind of war, one where the truth was the first casualty. And Latin America, still recovering from the last war, became the perfect testing ground for this silent battlefield. In the years after the war, dozens of German scientists disappeared from Allied custody. Some went to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip, but others, the ones whose loyalty was in question, found their way south. In the jungles of Brazil, strange laboratories were built under private funding. Small aircraft flew in at night, delivering crates and men who spoke no Portuguese. Rumors spread among locals about ghost factories, places where men in white coats worked under armed guard, producing machines that made no sense. By the early 1950s, intelligence reports from Brazil and Argentina described these facilities as scientific sanctuaries. No proof ever surfaced, but witnesses told stories of strange lights in the forests and foreign men living quietly among locals, using false names, always paying in cash. Some claimed these scientists were working on nuclear research. Others said they were building prototypes for rockets and weapons never meant for the public eye. And through it all, both the U.S. and Soviet Union pretended not to see, because both had something to gain. By the time the Cold War took full shape, Latin America had become a mirror of global tension. Every rumor, every coup, Every revolution carried echoes of the propaganda seeds planted during World War II. Brazil, once a key ally, now found itself torn between loyalty to Washington and resentment of its influence. Students protested American cultural domination. Politicians warned of foreign spies manipulating the press. And in small towns, old men whispered that the Nazis had never truly left. They had simply changed uniforms. When the CIA declassified its early Latin American files decades later, one sentence stood out. Information control remains our most effective weapon. The black propaganda of the war, leaflets, fake broadcasts, manufactured fear, had evolved into a permanent strategy. And the people who once believed they were free from manipulation realized they were still living under its shadow.